Last November, we had over 31,000 people registered for the November test. But this year, we've got nearly 50,000 registered for the November LSAT. Massive year over year increase. But before you start worrying, you should know that those big numbers don't always hold. As test day gets closer, you're going to see some people drop out of the test. A lot of that's going to happen when October LSAT scores post in about 10 days. Some people will see their score and decide not to retake in November. Others are going to realize that their practice test scores aren't close to their goals, or maybe their schedules change. So some people will drop out. But that early count still matters because it sets the scope of the competition, scholarship pressure, and admissions behavior from now until then. This November, you are going to be walking into a test environment that's more crowded, more alert, and more, frankly, aggressive than last year's. So you can't treat this as business as usual. The stakes are higher, more people taking the LSAT this year, more people applying, and that means your plan has got to be sharper and focus on execution first and foremost. Now, the first thing you've got to realize is that there are going to be more people with high scores applying, more people applying to the same schools you are. That means that admissions are going to make cuts and comparisons faster. If your file lands later or your score is a bit lower than it should be, you risk being waitlisted. The other thing you should know is that schools will be protecting their medians more seriously because they have a larger pool of applicants to pull from. And so if your score is below the median, they might find more applicants elsewhere to help protect their numbers and keep their medians high. If you are at or above the medians, though, you've got more negotiating room. Now, schools have a limited set of scholarship money to pull from. It's the same number of dollars as last year, or maybe slightly more, but more people competing means better numbers, better scores will grab better offers. A later score or a weaker score might still get something, but probably less than it would have in prior years. Now, because registrations may drop as the test gets closer, that doesn't change the fact that early submitters are still in the best position. When scores come out, you want your application ready to hit submit when they come back on the 24th. And if you can submit quickly, that gives you a better advantage over those who are scrambling to pull it all together post-score release. Now, one of the biggest things we anticipate for students is to recognize the drop-off as the test gets closer, to model behavior shifts post-score, and to plan for a field that is dense early and softer later. That's how you stay ahead. Now, with this many people in the mix, you don't win by just trying harder. You win by executing cleaner, faster, and smarter. In logical reasoning, before you even look at the choices, spot the conclusion, the evidence, and the gap between the two. Pre-phrase in simple language. Recognize the different question type families like strengthen, weaken, assumption, parallel, and so on, not using vague umbrella labels. Use a two-pass triage approach. What I mean by this is lock down the easy points first, flag and skip the hardest ones, and come back to them later. In reading comp, you want to map every paragraph's function. Is it defining terms? Is it providing evidence? Is it critiquing a viewpoint? Is it proposing a viewpoint? Never pick a choice without anchoring to a specific line in the text. Also, divide your section times in advance. Work on your pacing. Know how much time per question you can afford. Midway through a section, if your pacing is off, adjust. Don't wait until you're already panicking to change your approach. Now, you've got only 3 to 4 weeks till your test in November. If you're taking it then, spend the next week diagnosing and cataloging. That means take a full timed practice test in real conditions with strict timing, strict breaks. That's it. Then note your mistakes in logical reasoning and reading comp that consistently cost you points. That becomes your attack plan. In week 2, you focus on specific skill blocks. Maybe in the mornings, you're working on logical reasoning drills, targeting your weakest question types. In the afternoon, high-speed reading comp mapping. And in the evening, deep review for every single question. Make sure you know why the wrong answers tripped you up, and take a full rest day here and there to recharge so you don't burn out. In week 3, you're doing timed sections back to back under real-world test day conditions. Every third day, you swap in a full-length practice test. After each one, do a full autopsy. Adjust your pacing where you need to, because you want to train under pressure now. In the final week, 2 full exams under test day conditions, same time of day, same practice breaks, same pacing. No new strategies, no weird experiments in the final week. Solidify your test day environment, your scratch paper, and your warm-up. You want test day to feel as ordinary and as boring as possible. Of course, if you had 8 weeks or 12 weeks, say if you were going for January, you would add in more foundational work, more pacing work, then stabilize, but you can't afford to do that when your test is in November, less than 1 month away. You want this as clean as possible. Now, because of how many people are taking this test coming up, many people will end up switching gears, retaking in January just by necessity. So if you are planning to retake in January, if you're considering it, after your November test, reconstruct test day within 24 hours. Note where you were losing time, which logical reasoning types you were weak on, which reading topics strained you mentally. You want to note all of this on notebooks so that you can review after the fact for your January retake plan. If your score is within a couple points of your goal, but you didn't quite hit it, you should retake. In fact, I recommend everybody retake the LSAT at least once, because law schools do not average multiple scores. They only take the highest score. So there is really no downside to retaking. If you do worse, no big deal. If you do better, well, now you're then applying for with a better score. Now, we got a question here from Tessa Jane asking why we have so many people applying, why it's up year over year. A couple of reasons for this. One of them is the removal of logic games maybe about a year ago or so at this point. The test being easier, fewer sections to study, means more people taking, more LSAT score inflation as a result. A lot of people were scared of logic games, and now they're no longer on the test, so the LSAT seems less intimidating. We also had the presidential election cycle last year. That tends to get people more politically inclined, more politically engaged, wanting to change the system from within, being part of the bureaucracy, being part of the system, being a force for positive change. We also additionally have the fact that when the economy is kind of shaky or uncertain, when there's inflation in general in the economy, people want to wait out a bad employment situation, a bad job market by applying to law school, waiting it out, and coming out a couple of years later with a JD, better earning potential, better employment prospects. We saw this back in 2008 with the financial crisis. We saw it again in 2020 with the pandemic, and we're seeing it again both this cycle and last cycle, 2 years over year increases. And we expect that will only continue, of course, for this cycle at least. Maybe next year it'll drop down a little bit. Now, you don't want to wait for your score to come back before you start working on your applications. Like I said, applying earlier is better when you can, all else being equal. Now, you've got about 2 weeks or so between taking the LSAT and getting your score back. So for those of you who took October, getting your scores back in 10 days, hopefully you're working on your applications. If you're taking it in November, of course, focus on your LSAT prep first and foremost. But then once you take the November LSAT and you've got 2 weeks to work on your applications, wrap them up so that when the scores come back end of the month, you can hit submit. So that means your personal statement, optional essays, your resume, requesting letters of rec, pulling together your school list in terms of where you're going to apply. You want to get all that together now. Your recommenders, especially because you're relying on them to do work for you, give them bullet points to make it easier to help guide them to write the strongest letter possible, and have everything ready so the second your score drops, you can hit submit. Now, when scores post, you want to ideally submit that day. There's no reason to not have it ready by then, because that gets you in front of admissions before the flood of applicants that come in the following couple of days after the fact. Now, with so many people entering the law school admission cycle this year, so many taking it in November, I understand the anxiety and the pressure, the second guessing. You'll see people online freaking out, wondering if they prepped enough, and trolls celebrating every bad score as a sign that others failed, but ignore all of that. Expect there to be hard questions on the test. Expect there to be mistakes. Expect weird questions here and there. The difference is not whether your test has fluctuations or randomness, because of course it will. The question is whether that you can handle the turbulence. So be calm, be aggressive where you can, and be flexible where you need to adjust. And consider registering for January just as a backup for peace of mind. knowing that it's not all riding on the November LSAT, because while the LSAT as a whole is incredibly important, no one particular test date will make or break you. You can always retake. The January LSAT is not too late. The February LSAT also is not too late. You could take November, January, or February, or potentially all three of them and still apply to law school this cycle. It's totally fine to do so. Law schools expect it. They plan for it. Not at all a big deal. And for peace of mind, even if you're not planning on taking January, February, it can help to know that it's not all riding on that one test date. Now, speaking of anxiety, we got a question here from Layla saying, every time I sit down for a real LSAT, my brain just shuts off. How do you calm down in the moment? So I have a multifaceted or multi-part answer to this. Part of it is that when your mind goes blank, you're experiencing a biological event. Your brain has two main modes. It has logic and it has survival. Logic is the mode you want to have for the LSAT, where you're analytical, you're skeptical, you're calm, you're curious. But the biological response is more of the fight or flight. That's the mode your brain uses when it thinks you're in danger. And the LSAT can feel scary because you know there's that countdown timer. It's high stakes. Your future's on the line. So your brain thinks to itself it's life or death. And that's when your logic, your reasoning center, literally just shuts off because your body thinks it's being chased by a bear, and that's why you're getting sweaty. So blanking out isn't necessarily because you just didn't study enough. It's because your body has taken over control from your brain and you need to reset it. And you can reset it through mindfulness meditation, breathing exercise. It doesn't have to be spiritual or religious in nature, just maybe 10 seconds where you take a reset routine to first breathe on purpose, focus on your breath, one slow breath in through your nose, out through your mouth. But you're not breathing randomly here. You want to experience and notice the flow of the breath, because that one breath tells your body that you're not in danger. And you're able to then interrupt the panic cycle. And you want to articulate what's happening. You want to think to yourself, okay, this is just stress and it's normal. You're labeling the feeling instead of getting dragged down by it. And once you name it, your brain can separate you from the anxiety of the experience of the adrenaline of test day. That way you're observing it analytically, third person, objectively, rather than drowning in the biological or hormonal responses. And you want to return to your checklist, your step-by-step approach that you take when you first see a question. Maybe it's you read the setup, find the conclusion, and look for the flaw in the argument. So as soon as you catch yourself spiraling, you want to drop back into that checklist because your brain loves structure. If you can follow the same process every single time, you give yourself something safe to grab onto, and that can become your reset button. A breath, a label, a checklist, and you get yourself back into control. And most people will experience some kind of panic on test day, and that's totally normal. But we want you to be the kind of student who can recover rather than failing. And that's when you have a plan for what happens when you experience the stress so that you don't spiral. Because you can't just think your way out of the stress. You need to have a reset routine in place that you practice during your practice tests so that it becomes like muscle memory, so that you black out, but you recover and you train for that experience. You train it like a habit. So when you do a time section, I want you to try picking some random question midway through the section and then just stop. Close your eyes, take one slow breath, run that mental checklist, the step-by-step approach, and then come back to it. And at first, it might feel silly, but after a few sessions, it becomes automatic, and that's the point. Because that way, when your brain is spiraling on test day, it'll remember, we've done this before, we know how to recover. And you can't expect to fully eliminate nerves. That's never going to happen. You just want to be able to manage the nerves when you experience them. Because a little anxiety can actually be helpful. It sharpens you, it keeps you alert and focused. Because if you felt nothing at all, like you didn't care, like you were too apathetic, you might actually be too relaxed to perform well. You want to be in that sweet spot where you are hyper alert, but not panicked. So in this way, the LSAT becomes something beyond just a test of logic. It becomes a test of emotional regulation. Every section on the test measures not just how well you can reason, but how well you can stay present when your brain tries to escape or run out of the room. We see this with our students all the time. Once they learn how to manage that level of anxiety, their scores jump 5, 10 points without learning a single new concept because they stop fighting themselves. So if you take nothing else away from this, don't try to be fearless on test day because you don't need that. You just need a reset button, a way to catch yourself, breathe, and get back to doing what you've trained for. That is the real test day skill. Not calmness, not perfection, just control. Now let's get back into logical reasoning. I wanted to share some thoughts about strengthened versus sufficient assumption questions. Really common struggle where students can't tell the difference between the two or what they're asking for. Now, the difference between these two types is huge, but mixing them up leads to wrong answers and wasted time. So strengthened versus sufficient assumption. If the question says, which one of the following, if true, most strengthens the argument, that is naturally a strengthened question. But if it says, which one of the following, if assumed, allows the conclusion to be properly drawn, that is a sufficient assumption. That means you are looking for an answer that guarantees the conclusion. Strengthen helps the argument, sufficient proves the argument. So you want to imagine the argument like a bridge. In a strengthened question, the bridge might exist, but it has some cracks, and your job is to patch it up and make it stronger. In a sufficient assumption question, the bridge is missing, and your job is to build a brand new support that connects the premises to the conclusion 100%. So in strengthened questions, the correct answer might be strong or it might be subtle, and you're adding support, not guaranteeing. In a sufficient assumption question, the correct answer is usually very strong, and it logically forces the conclusion to follow. Now, here's where people get tricked. The LSAT loves to throw strengthened style answers into sufficient assumption questions and vice versa. So you'll see answers that make the argument better, but don't fully prove it. And they'll be tempting, but they'll be wrong. So your rule here is in sufficient assumption questions, if it doesn't guarantee the conclusion, it's out, you eliminate it. In a strengthened question, if it doesn't help at all, it's out, but the help can be small or big. So let's suppose we had an example, an argument where they say, all professional musicians practice daily. Lisa is a professional musician, therefore Lisa plays piano. Now, a strengthened answer might say, most professional musicians play piano. And that helps. It makes the conclusion more plausible. A sufficient answer would have to say, all professional musicians play piano. That guarantees the conclusion, and so Lisa must play piano. Really important difference here. Now, another classic LSAT trap is when students get confused between weakened questions and flaw questions, because both deal with bad arguments and they both want you to see the problem. But your job on each one is totally different. And if you mix them up, you'll either try to destroy something that's already broken or miss the chance to attack when you're supposed to. Now, you always want to start with the question stem. Weakened questions will say things like, which one of the following, if true, most seriously undermines the argument? In contrast, a flaw question will say something like, the reasoning in the argument is most vulnerable to criticism on the grounds that, yada, yada. So in weakened, you're adding something new that makes the argument worse. In a flaw question, you are identifying something that is already wrong with it. So in weakened questions, you are actively sabotaging the argument. And in flaw questions, you are more passively diagnosing a problem with the argument. So think of it like in a flaw question, you are a movie critic pointing out what is wrong with the film. But in a weakened question, you're like a hacker who's trying to break a system. That's why the right answer in a flaw question will usually name the error, like assumes causation from correlation, or confuses necessary and sufficient conditions, or fails to consider an alternative explanation. Whereas for a weakened question, they are introducing new information that casts doubt on the argument. Now, in a flaw question, the stimulus is already fundamentally flawed in some way. Your job is just to spot how. But in a weakened question, the argument might look solid until you come in and drop a new fact that ruins it or hurts it. So for flaw questions, you want to ask, what is the logical mistake here? For a weakened question, you're asking, what could I say that would make this argument fall apart? Totally different mindset. Now, here is your quick summary again. Once again, weakened questions, you are a saboteur, where you are adding new information that makes the argument worse. For a flaw question, you are diagnosing and you're pointing out what is already logically broken. So remember, in weakened, you are attacking. In flaw, you are analyzing. Now, let's talk about pacing and logical reasoning. In logical reasoning, you have about 25, 26 questions, and the timing is a huge factor because the LSAT is as much a test of strategy as it is of intelligence. So I'm going to give you a pacing framework that works whether you're aiming for a 165 or a 175. Now, note that you've got 35 minutes under standard time constraints, about 1 minute and 24 seconds per question on average. But you should not spend the same amount of time on every single question. You want to use a tiered approach. For the first 10 questions, you want to aim to solve them in roughly 10 minutes because they are generally easier and they get harder as the section goes on. For the mid-difficulty questions, maybe closer to 1:45. For the hardest, maybe close to 2 minutes. You bank time on the easier ones to save for the harder ones later that truly need it. So going faster on the early questions will help you go slower later when it truly counts. Far too many students get bogged down being perfectionists on the easy questions, then they have no choice but to rush towards the end where every second matters. So instead, don't do that. Move quickly and confidently through those first 10 questions, flag anything that feels sticky, keep going, and circle back to those tough questions later. Now, note that after the first 10 minutes, you want to be at about roughly question number 10. After 20 minutes, you're around roughly question 15, 16, 17, and you have the remaining time for the hardest questions later in this section. And remember that no single question is worth more than any other. They're all worth the same one raw score point. So if you feel like you're spending 3 minutes on a single question and you're not making any headway, you don't have a confident answer, I want you to just let it go. Mark it, guess if you need to, move on, circle back. You can always come back later, but don't sacrifice 3 other questions just to maybe win a stubborn, tough one. Now, pacing is a skill that needs practice, and that's why we have our students do at least 10 full exams before test day. So test day itself feels like just another run through, and you've already worked out all your pacing issues. You have that internal sense of rhythm. So for now, if you want to use a timer, totally fine. I find that far too many students will get stuck in the drilling phase of their prep for far too long. I want you to, at some point, especially if you're taking it in November, but also for those of you taking January, I want you to think about moving on from the drilling, doing more pacing work under timed conditions, individual sections, and full-length exams, because it's not enough to get the questions right in isolation. You got to get them right under test day conditions, considering the time constraint, considering that students will have to learn to let go. It's far too easy to be a perfectionist and want to get every single question right. But if getting bogged down on question 15 for 4 minutes costs you the last 5 questions of the section, not a good trade, not worth it. If you find that you are consistently running out of time, you've got to fix the underlying problems, like reading slowly, like being too indecisive, or being unclear on common question types. There is space to learn all of that, but you've got to know when to push and when to let go. And flagging and skipping is a huge benefit. I think it is wonderful that LSAT has built a flagging function into the online LSAT because skipping is a strategy. Top scorers don't answer every single question in order. They don't get stuck. They make fast decisions about what's worth their time and what's not. The LSAT does not reward you for being stubborn. It rewards you for getting as many questions right as possible within that 35-minute time constraint. So if you hit a question that feels like a trap or a time sink, don't fight it. Flag it, move on, come back later when there's time. Now, of course, you don't need to skip every single question that's hard, but as a general rule, you might want to skip if you've spent 90 seconds and still have no clue, if you can't find the conclusion, if you can't eliminate anything, if you can't even articulate what they're asking, that is your cue to bail and flag it, come back later. But in contrast, if you understand the argument and you're just debating between two answers, it's worth staying on to finish it off. Now, again, when I talk about flagging, I'm not saying to flag 5, 10 questions or every single question that you're getting stuck on or having trouble with. Flag it only if you realistically think it's worth coming back to later. If you know what it's asking, if you're able to eliminate a couple answers, and you feel like a new, fresh perspective might help you crack it later, then flag it, skip it, come back later. Otherwise, just choose something and move on. Now, let's say you've got roughly 4 minutes left. You've completed this section and you have a couple flagged questions. You want to think about which ones you should tackle first. I would start with those where you've already eliminated a couple of choices because your odds are higher on those. Then secondly, once you've done those, move on to the ones that you kind of understand, but maybe you didn't have enough time in the moment. And finally, save the ones for last where you just had no clue and you were feeling kind of desperate. You might want to circle back to those and hope that a new look might give you a fresh perspective. Maybe you can make a more informed guess with a new look at it. But don't go back to those where you felt like you were totally at a loss and had no clue and it was like making your brain melt, because you might still get stuck in quicksand on those and it's just not worth it. And if you're noticing trends in what you are inclined to flag or what you are inclined to have no clue on, that's worth drilling on the side. Don't sacrifice it entirely. I mean, we're not at test day yet, right? So you've still got time to hopefully drill questions you're stuck on, questions you're not sure of, like the parallel reasoning questions, anything overly technical, science, philosophy, anything abstract in nature. You might want to drill those. And if your test is only a few weeks away, it might not be worth drilling those specifically. Maybe you want to work more on just the highest yield areas, like the more common logical reasoning types, specifically necessary assumption, inference, and flaw. But if you've already locked all of those down and you're at say 170 plus already, and you really want the 180, then in that case, of course, go for the parallels. Go for the technical science ones, for example. You don't want to leave any points on the table. Now let's talk about what to do when you're stuck between two choices, where you've read the question, you've knocked out 3 answers, and you're down to 2. And you're sitting there rereading, second guessing, changing your mind. And you've got to remember that one of them is objectively wrong, the other is objectively right. When they say which one of the following most weakens or most strengthens, that's a way for them to cover themselves. Typically, you're going to find that for a weakened question, only one choice actually weakens, the other 4 do not. For a strengthened question, one choice strengthens, the other 4 do not. There is always an objectively single right answer. The first step to break the tie between two is to first restate the conclusion and the evidence. Go back to the argument. What are they actually saying? The conclusion is X, the support is Y. Then you want to make sure that you are crystal clear on the question type. Is it necessary assumption? Is it weaken? Is it flaw? Is it inference? Articulate the question type, because that determines what the correct answer should say. Then you go back to your 2 contenders and you ask, does this answer actually do what this question type demands? If it's a weakened question, does this answer introduce a fact that makes the conclusion less likely? If it's an inference question, is the answer directly supported by the stimulus, or is it going too far? Now, if both of them seem kind of right, it means you don't fully understand the question yet. So you want to go back to the conclusion. If you're changing your answer multiple times, if you're waffling back and forth, you want to make sure you can stick with the one that better matches the reasoning of the argument. And if you're seeing new language that appeals to you, remember that it's all about function. What role does this choice play in relation to the argument? When we consider the question type, when we look at the question type from that proper perspective, what impact does this choice have in terms of affecting the argument? And if you're still unsure, always make a choice based on logic. Flag it if you have to, move on, come back later. Don't let one question ruin your rhythm. Every section will have a few questions that might not click for you, and that's okay, even for top scorers. But what top scorers do differently is they don't get bogged down, they don't get stuck, they don't spiral. They recognize that even if they don't understand a particular question, it doesn't have to tank the whole exam. You can still get a top score getting a question wrong here or there. The raw score conversion charts will prove this for you. Now, let's talk about test anxiety and having a foggy brain, because when you feel pressure and you read a sentence and you have no idea what it just said, it's part of the mental game. And with the test coming up, we want to help you prepare for that mental game and protect your brain, protect your emotions, your mindset when it matters most. And test day anxiety is not random. It's your brain freaking out and overanalyzing everything. So you got to have a pre-test ritual in place that grounds you. Now, part of that is waking up early so you're not rushing the day of the test. You want to do something physical, like going for a walk, stretching, doing a short workout. You want to eat something familiar, nothing new on test day, and review one thing you've mastered as a warm-up to help you build up your confidence. Maybe you want to listen to music, meditate, you breathe, whatever calms your system to prime your brain to show up under pressure when it truly matters. And if during the test you're 12 questions in and you have no idea what you're reading, remember that 5-second reset. Close your eyes, you breathe in, you breathe out, and you tell yourself, next question, fresh mindset. If you're feeling stuck, flag it, move on, come back later when you're mentally sharper. Don't fight an uphill battle. And repeat to yourself, one question at a time. I know how to do this. The answer is in the argument. Make those your mantras for when you're spiraling, when you're getting stuck. If you're hitting a rough patch, don't spiral, just let it go. One question will not define the section or the entire exam. You want to recenter, sit tall, breathe, and reset your internal clock and focus on nailing the next question. Your goal is not to be perfect, it's to recover quickly and maintain your pacing. And the pressure on test day is real. A foggy brain is real, but it doesn't have to be a surprise. That's why in the lead up to the test, especially in the final weeks, full sections under realistic pressure, simulating test day, and managing your mindset. That alone can make the difference between a 165 and a 175. And if you'd like my help in these final weeks, final months before the test, I'm offering free LSAT tutoring lessons to everyone out there watching this. Unpluggedprep.com/start. Link below this video on YouTube, link in my bio on Instagram, or take a photo of the QR code up there in the corner. I'm happy to help you out. I want to meet with as many students as I possibly can before your test to make sure you're set up for success. Really 100% free LSAT tutoring lesson, unpluggedprep.com/start. I'm happy to help you all out. In the meantime, I wish you all the best and take care.